It was impossible. I knew that all the religions of the world were not like puzzle pieces that fit together. And so this quest for knowledge and for truth and for spiritual understanding was tempered with this idea that I knew that what I was looking for was a definite truth. And it wasn't just a sort of, it wasn't a fad. It wasn't just a hobby. This was a serious thing, because I knew that something had to be true. And if it was true, it had to be deep, it had to be lasting, and it had to have meaning that went right to the core of my being. And so I was 21 and I had been studying different religions without any real success for about a year. Debbie and her family were telling me about the Bible, about Jesus, but I tried to keep it at arm's length, because that one religion, Christianity in particular, just seemed so strange and alien, as I said. But really, my story reaches its peak on Friday, December the 6th, 2002, when at about 7:30 p.m., I was standing in a late night bookshop in the center of Oxford, standing in the religion section, looking for yet another book that might be able to scratch that itch, answer that question. And as I looked for a book that might be able to point me in the direction of truth, I noticed to my right, there was a display table with many copies of the same book set out on display on special offer. I was attracted immediately because the front cover of the book was a bright blue color, and blue is my favorite color. So it leapt out at me immediately. I walked over to the table and I picked up one of these books, and the name of the book was Conversations with God, written by a man named Neale Donald Walsch. I had never heard of the man. I had never before seen the book, but when I read what was on the back, I was intrigued. And then when I opened the book up and skimmed a few pages on the inside, I was enthralled by what I saw. Neale Donald Walsch is an American man who claims that in the early 1990s, at a very low point in his life, he was inspired to write a letter to God. He said that he had a habit of venting and releasing his frustration by writing letters to people who had annoyed him or done something wrong to him, made him feel bad. He would write letters to them with no intention of showing them the letter, just as a means of getting out his frustration. Dear boss, he would write if he had had a bad day at work. Dear boss, I hate your guts. I wish you would fall out the window or something, and just vent his frustration, tear the letter up, put it in the bin. But at this point in the early 90s, Walsch says that he was in such a low point in his life. Things had gone so badly for him, so wrong, that he decided to write one of those letters to God. And so he got a pen and a paper and he wrote, "Dear God, why is my life in such a foul state?" And as he wrote this tirade against God, fully prepared to tear that note up the same as all others and throw it in the bin, he said that as he finished the note, it was as if he heard a voice so clearly, he turned because he thought someone else was in the room. And the voice spoke to him and said, "Do you want answers to these questions, or are you just venting?" And he said in that moment, it was as if he was inspired, compelled to continue writing, as if something took control of him, control of his hand that held the pen. And suddenly he watched as out from the tip of the pen flowed a response to his letter, the questions that he had been asking. And what began that day in that man's life was a back and forth written conversation between him and what he claims is a spiritual, supernatural, invisible force that takes control of his body and writes back to him. And the book that I held in my hand, Conversations with God, was that man's written letters to this invisible spirit being and the responses that he said came back to him. Now, he claims that the one that communicated with him, this invisible spirit, was and is God, the creator of all things. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, hold on a minute. Somebody says that they write letters to God and God writes back to them. Surely that guy's not just a weirdo, but a wacko. How can you possibly trust somebody who says something like that? And I had that thought. But when I opened up the book and when I read a few pages inside, I was captivated by the things that the man claimed were coming to him from this spirit. Incredibly complex spiritual ideas, paradoxes that made perfect sense, very deep ideas, but explained so very simply in one or two sentences. In all that time that I had been studying religion and reading about spirituality, I had never come across anything that explained spiritual ideas so simply, so effectively. I thought to myself, there has to be something to this. It has to be the case that this man is communicating with a higher power, with a higher mind, a higher intelligence. And so, forgetting about all other books in that bookshop, I immediately took that book to the counter and I paid for it and I took it home and I read it almost cover to cover that night. By about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was still reading and I hadn't quite finished the book because it was so extraordinary to me that I would read entire chapters twice. Rather than going to the next chapter, I would go back and reread that chapter again. I would reread pages over and over again. It was so extraordinary what I was reading. And you might be wondering, well, what was it that you were reading in that book? The man was receiving from this invisible spirit this particular message, that in the beginning, the only thing, the only one that existed was God, all by himself. That God knew everything, but had never done anything. And so the book said that God created the universe and created the earth. And then in order to go from knowing everything to experiencing everything, the book says that God divided himself into millions and millions of smaller pieces and sent those smaller pieces to the earth to live as human beings. So the core idea of this book, Conversations with God, is that human beings are divine, that we are one with God, that we ourselves, human beings, are gods. And the meaning of life isn't to be religious or to be spiritual. The book said that the meaning of life was to do and experience everything that there is to do and everything that there is to experience. To be happy, to be sad, to laugh, to cry, to experience good and evil, and to have knowledge of both. And by doing and experiencing everything there is to do and experience, God goes from knowing everything to having experienced everything. It was a fascinating idea. It was unlike anything I'd read in any of the other books I had bought. And I thought there might be something to this. The book said over and over again that there was no such thing as heaven, that there was no such thing as hell, no such thing as sin or judgment, because the meaning of life was to do and experience everything, both good and bad. So there would never be a judgment. There would never be a hell. There was no punishment for doing wrong because there was no wrong, the book said. And one thing the book emphasized repeatedly was that there was no such thing as the devil, that the devil did not exist. The devil was a fabrication, an imagination in the minds of people who were too afraid to believe that God would be so nice and kind, he would let them do anything without consequence. So the people would create in their minds this enemy figure, the devil, trying to entice people to do evil. I believed every word in the book. And as I say, by about 2 o'clock, I was towards the end of this particular book, and I thought maybe this is the thing that I've been looking for. This might just be the answer to the questions that I've had over the last year, at that point, year and a half. But I thought, how can I know for sure? How can I know for certain that this is the truth that I've been looking for? And then I had a brainwave. I looked across my bedroom, and there on the counter was a small notepad and a biro pen. And I thought to myself, of course, I'm going to write my own letter to God. And so I took that pen and that notepad, and I sat on my bed after 2 o'clock in the morning, and I wrote the words, "Dear God, hi, are you there? You know I want to talk to you. You know I've been looking for you. Please, will you speak to me the same way that you spoke to the man in the book?" And then I sat there and I waited, and nothing happened. And I remember thinking about what I had seen in movies when a ray of light shone from heaven and a voice spoke from the clouds. And I remember even looking at the bedroom window, wondering if a ray of light was going to come into my room. But nothing happened. And I sat there in silence. I added some more to the note. God, please, if you're out there, please speak to me just like you spoke to the man in the book. You know how much I want to know the truth. Will you please answer me? But again, nothing happened. And I don't know if anyone else has had this feeling, this frustrating feeling that it works for everyone else, but not for me. Everyone else gets the breaks. It seems to go right for everyone else, but why, oh why doesn't it work for me? And I remember sitting there that night feeling like, why is this not working? If this man said this is what happened to him, why am I sat here and nothing is happening? And that frustration boiled over into anger. You need to understand that this wasn't a game to me. I had spent the past 18 months diligently searching for the truth about God, because inside of me was that emptiness, that hole, that echoing chasm that longed to be filled, was so hungry to be filled. But I couldn't find anything to fill that hole anywhere. And I had reached my breaking point. And I sat on my bed that night and I was fuming because nothing was happening. And I took the pen and I wrote my own very angry letter to God. Why won't you speak to me? You say that you love me. You say that you love us. But look at this world, all of the violence, all of the children who are murdered, all of the war and the brutality and the things that people do to one another. You don't really love us. I wrote, your love is a lie. And I wrote this very long, angry letter to God. And the very last thing that I wrote was, you are an uncaring God. That was the last thing I wrote in my angry note. You are an uncaring God. And then I threw down the notepad and pen, and I just sat there on my bed, and I was so angry because I thought, I've done it again. I've wasted more money on another book that had promises that are just empty promises. And I felt like I was right back at square one. I had been so convinced that what I was holding in my hands in that book, Conversations with God, was the truth. And now here I was, seemingly nowhere. And I sat there for a few moments, so angry, so lost. And that's when it happened. Suddenly, I found myself staring at that notepad, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the paper. Unblinkingly staring at the whiteness of the paper, that whiteness seemed to expand and shine. It was as if somebody turned down, not the lights with a dimmer switch, but the whole world, as if everything else just shrank and disappeared and became insignificant. And it was just myself and that notepad. And I'm staring at it without blinking. And I could hear my breathing changing, my breath echoing in my ears. This buzzing sensation, crackling sensation in my ears, inside my chest. The feeling of an attraction, like magnet and metal. I felt that coming out of my chest, drawing me towards the paper. All of these sensations were very real, very vivid, and I was completely unafraid by all of it. I had never experienced a trance in my life, but that's exactly what was happening. I was slipping into a trance and pulled and compelled towards that notepad. Suddenly I watched as if I was a spectator standing behind another and looking over his shoulder. I watched as my hand reached out, took the biro pen, and as the tip of the pen touched on the paper, the pen began to swirl round and round in these spiraling shapes. The sound of the tip of the pen scratching on the paper was so loud it filled the room. Breathing so intensely, watching as these spirals appeared on the page, a chain of letters, unbroken, no spaces between the words. When the pen reached the end of the line, it just scratched downwards and backwards to the line underneath and continued going until 2 lines of unbroken letters filled the page on the note paper. And as the pen reached the end of that second line, suddenly my fingers released the pen, and it was like suddenly I was snapped out of this trance, and I found myself staring at a sentence which said, "It is of no consequence what you call me. It is of no consequence what you call me." And in that moment, my friend, I was terrified. I was terrified. And you might say, well, I thought you were waiting for something to happen. I was. But when something actually happened, I realized in that moment, I don't believe this stuff. I don't believe any of this. This is Hollywood. This is Steven Spielberg. This is the X-Files. This is the really real world where this stuff doesn't happen. I realized in that moment, I don't believe in spirits and angels and ghosts and invisible things. But there it was, right in front of me. And I knew that I had not written those words. It is of no consequence what you call me. And looking back at the angry note that I had written, the last words were, "You are an uncaring God." That was the last thing I had written in my note. You're an uncaring God. And now there were the words, "It is of no consequence what you call me." With absolute terror, excitement, nervousness, I picked up the biro pen and I wrote, "God, was that you? Please speak to me again if that was you." And nothing happened. And I read and reread that sentence, "It is of no consequence what you call me," over and over again. And then I realized what he meant. And I was right, and I wrote,